Hi, my name is Beth Massey, and today I'm going to show you some techniques on working with data in a Windows application by going through each of the layers and objects responsible for working with data, from creating a stored procedure in our database, connecting it to a table adapter and a data set, and then connecting the data set onto the form using a binding source. We'll dig a little bit into these objects, showing examples of working with them in our Visual Basic code. So how do we work with data in Windows Forms? We have a database and we have a form with one or more controls contained on it. And the idea is we need to get that data from our database and populate those controls. Likewise, we need to get the data from the controls back into the database. So how does this happen? There are three objects that make data binding work. The first is the table adapter. It connects directly to our database. It has all the data access code, the select, the insert, the update, delete statements. The table adapters work with data sets. The data sets contain the structure and the actual data that's retrieved from the database. A data set is composed of multiple data tables, which then have rows of data. A data set is basically just a client-side representation of a database tables. The binding source manages row positions and the control bindings. So the control actually connects to the binding source directly, and the binding source is responsible for managing the row position inside of those data tables in our data set. So I've got Visual Studio open here, and I just created a simple project Windows Forms application called Understanding Data, and it's just sitting on the default form. I've got the Server Explorer open, and you'll notice that it's connected to a very simple database that we've been creating in the previous Forms over Data video series videos. It's got customers, orders, order details, very simple. It's also got a few stored procedures. So in order to show you how data works in our Windows applications, I'm going to start with the database, and we're going to create a stored procedure. So I'm going to right-click, add stored procedure, and this stored procedure is going to select some customers for us. I'm going to call it get customer by last name. Okay, and as you can imagine, what I'm going to do is select customers that match a certain last name. So I'm going to pass in a parameter called last name, and it's a varchar 50. Okay, and then we're going to create our select statement. And we're going to select all the fields. Okay, from customer. And our where clause will be where last name is like our parameter. So this means where last name starts with our parameter. Okay, so this is like a wildcard character, this percent here. Okay, so we're just going to press save here, and that will add our stored procedure right here into the database. Okay, so it's time to connect to that database, and as you recall from that diagram, we need a table adapter to do that, and the table adapter will fill a data set for us. So I'm going to close this here, and I'm just going to go to the data menu, and we're going to add a new data source. And I'm going to connect to our database, click next, and you'll see that it knows that we were working with our database just now, and it's automatically selecting that for the new connection. So we'll click next. And I've already walked through a lot of this in the previous videos, but we're just going to select customer here and name it customer dataset. And this will create our dataset as well as the table adapter. Okay, so if we double click on customer dataset here, it'll open up the dataset designer, and you'll see the table adapter down here. Okay, so it automatically generates default table adapter for us with some default commands. So the command is, if you hover over it, it's selecting all of the rows inside of the customer database or table. So that's not usually a good idea. You don't want to normally select all of the rows inside of your table because there could be thousands of them and that would affect performance. So that's the reason why we created a stored procedure that requires a parameter. So it's going to just return a subset. So in order to configure this table adapter, we're just going to right-click and we're going to add a new query. And we're going to specify to use an existing stored procedure. So we'll go ahead and click Next. And then we go ahead and drop down this drop down and you'll see our stored procedure here. And it just lists the parameters and the results. Okay, so the results is actually going to be a tabular data, meaning we're selecting a results set of data rows. You can also write stored procedures that return functions that are single values, that return single values or no values, okay, as well. So we're going to select the first option, and then I'm just going to name this fill by last name and get data by last name. And the difference here is that fill by last name, you pass it an existing data table and it fills it for you. And with get data methods, they return a new data table for you. Okay, so I'm going to click Next. And that generated all of the stuff we needed to generate. And you'll see down here now, you'll see the command type is stored procedure here. Okay, so just going to go ahead and press save on that. And now we're ready to hook this baby up to our form. Okay, so to do that, we're going to jump over to our form. And now when we go to the data sources window, you can open the data sources window. I just had it on the tab here, but you can go up to the data menu and just say show data sources. You'll see here's our customer data table. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create a grid. Okay, so I'm just going to drag this over, put it right about here. Okay, so great, and I'm going to let's just make it a little bit, tiny bit bigger, and let's anchor it to the form. And then we'll go ahead and make the form a little bit bigger. There we go. Let's take that away now. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is also edit some of the columns in there because I don't want the user to see the customer ID or this modified column. Okay, it still will exist in the data table. We're just not going to show it. Okay, so now we've got a control. So when I drag this over, you'll notice that it created what's called the binding source. Okay, so this was in our diagram. The binding source hooks the controls up to the data set. Okay, so it sits in between the data table, inside of the data set. So you'll notice the customer data set has a data table inside of it called customer. Okay. The customer binding source is actually hooked to that. And you can see that by looking in the properties. You can see data member is customer. That's the table. And the data source is the data set. So if we expanded this, you'll see here's the customer data set. Okay, that's on our form. And then once we select the data source, then it knows what's inside is the customer. If we had multiple data tables in here, they would be listed. Okay, so that's what hooks it up. So now, okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now we have all of the pieces that were there on the diagram that we started out with. Okay, so we have the database and the data, the stored procedure, the table adapter here, which is also dropped onto our form for us. And that table adapter is going to fill this data set, and the way that the controls work with the data inside this data set is through this binding source. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to want to hook this up to the stored procedure, right? So in order to do that, there's a couple things we could do. We could call the table adapter, because now the table adapter is going to automatically have a method on it called fill by last name. We could do that in code, or there's also an easy way to do it with the data grid view here, is we can expand this and go to add query, okay, and then we can select an existing query name, and you'll notice that there's our fill by last name right here. So when we do this, click OK, it will automatically create another tool strip for us that will allow us to type in the last name. And then when we click this button, you'll see that it wrote some code for us. Okay, it automatically calls this fill by last name for us. Okay, so it hooks it all in. So I'm going to go through some of this code for you so you understand what's going on. First of all, when we drag and drop that customer data table onto our form there, it automatically put this line of code in here, which calls the default, which selects all of the rows inside of our customer table, which we don't want to do. What we want to do is have the user specify the search. So we're going to wait until they type something in to fill the data. And in that case, when they fill the data, I click this button, it's going to call fill by last name. So you can see now the table adapter is calling our stored procedure for us in our database. So the table adapter is what connects to that database directly. All right, so you'll also see that the table adapter updates our database. And up here, this code was also generated for us when we drop that table on there. And what it's doing here is it's just telling the binding source to make sure it's finished with all of its editing. Because remember, that binding source is sitting in between the data set and our controls. So the binding source can do all sorts of stuff for us, like buffering or transacting the changes to the data rows for us. So we want to make sure that we're done. We make sure that all of that data that we've typed in those controls is flushed to the data rows. Okay, so we do that, and then we go ahead and call the table adapter update, and we pass it the data table customer, and that data set, not only does it manage all of the structure and the data inside of the data tables, it manages the changes for us too. So it keeps track of any update, inserts, or deletes that we're doing inside, or anything in there. So you can get a lot of information out of that data set. So we're gonna play with some of this stuff in a minute. So let's just run this really quick though and make sure it's working for us. So I'm gonna hit F5. Okay, so you can see it comes up blank, so we're required to enter a search string. So I am going to type S, and I'm just going to click this button, and then there you go. You see the data is populated correctly. We've got 2 customers with last name starting with S. Okay, great. Okay, so that seems to work, calling our stored procedures through our table adapter to fill our data set, to bind to our data grid through the binding source. And that used all 3 of those objects to do that. So now we don't actually have to go back to our database to filter data if we just want to filter data that we already have on the client. So to go through an example, let's filter the data we've got already. So I'm going to filter on, say, the first name as well. And what we're going to do, the object we use to do the filtering on the client side is the binding source. Okay, so the customer binding source in this case, we can set a filter on that. So let's for this demonstration, let's add a new button here. Okay, let's double click on that. And what we're going to do is filter the data that we get back from the database further on the client. Okay, so customer binding source. If we take a look at some of these fields, okay, so there's filter. Also take a look at edit, allow new, allow remove. Okay, so the binding source can also determine what kind of edits you want to make to the data rows. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. There's the data source and data member. We went through these in the property sheet. The data source in this case is the data set. The data member is the customer data table. Okay, so there's the filter. So we're going to go ahead and set the filter, and it's going to be similar to our where clause. Oh, I don't want a last name though. I want first name. First name, like, and I think I have a Jim and an Amanda Smith, Jim Smith and Amanda Silver. So let's just hard code this for now. We'll do like A. Okay, well, starts with A basically. Okay, we'll just hard code that in. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and now what's going to happen is I'm going to go to the database now. Okay, it ran our stored procedure. Okay, now when I click this button, it's not going to go to the database. You see, it just filtered the data here on the data set itself. Okay, so there's another way we could do this through the binding source is where the recommended way to do it is, because the binding source, you could essentially change the data source underneath, right? The data source doesn't have to be a data set. I encourage you to watch the object binding series because the binding sources work with objects as well. Okay, so that's how we set a filter if we're working with controls. But what if we're just working with the data itself? So what we can do is when we're working with the data itself, we can actually create what's called a data view and then apply that onto our data table. So I'm just going to get us a little bit of room here, and let's write some code that creates a data view. So I'm going to do dim dv as new data view. And what it does is it allows us to specify a table because we're going to base our data view on a data table. So I'm just going to say me.customerDataSet.customer. Okay, so this will create a new view. And now what we can do on the view is we can do some stuff like DV row filter. So we could set the row filter. We could set it to be the same thing here. Okay, for instance. You could also set the sort. Okay, we can also set, if we're working with the controls, there's also a sort property on the binding source. But this is if we're working with the code directly, right? So we want to be able to, say, filter our data rows. So if I do this for each data row view, because a data view has a data row views. It's a collection of data row views. So as data row view, oops, spelled it wrong, excuse me. Data row view. Here it is. Okay. In. Okay. So it's basically, let's just do like a message box. Can't type today. And let's just say, put out the data row view, say the first column to string. Okay. So this will be the ID of the customer. Okay, so we should only see one message box, right? Because we've got a filter applied. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how this code runs. Okay, there's our stored procedure call. Now if I click this button, you'll see there's just number 4, and that's it. Okay, so because we created a new data view and we're iterating over that data view. Okay, so you can use data views to sort and filter your data tables directly, and that's how you can work with it inside of your code. So this technique, though, keep in mind, works with a set of data, right? So we're using a data row view over the entire data table. But more common scenario is that we need to know the row that the user is on, right? So we need to get back to the binding source in order to figure out what position we are inside of our data table. Okay, so we're going to use the binding source to get that information. So let's take a look at some of these properties on the binding source again. So me.customer binding source, you'll see there's a current item. Okay, so current is actually the data row. Okay, technically it's a data row view. Okay, so we just looked at a data row view. Basically, the binding source is managing a view on top of our data table, just like the one we created manually, right? So it's managing that position for us. Okay, so we could go to current and accept that it's an object, but we know that behind that data row view is that data row, and that data row is typed as a customer data row, right? So we can use what's a snippet. And I'm just going to go right click and insert snippet, right? If you haven't used snippets, you should definitely right click and say insert snippet and take a look at all of the wonderful pieces of code that Microsoft has provided for you. You can also create your own snippets. Okay, so I'm going to go into the data, designer features in ADO.NET, and then I'm going to select convert binding source current to a specific row in the data table. And so this snippet, it gives you some defaults, right? Luckily, one of our defaults is already there. It is actually customer binding source is what we really need. But if your name of the binding source was different, or in our case here, the name of the data row is different, we just type in the name of our customer data set dot customer row. Okay, so that's the type, and then our customer binding source dot current. So there's our row, except it doesn't see that. Oh, well, we know we have customer, excuse me. There we go. Customer binding source. Okay, so that row now is typed as our current. It's the current row that the user is on. Now, what I'm going to do just to be safe, because if we don't have any rows meaning that they didn't select anything from the database yet, then this code would actually fail because we wouldn't have, current would be nothing and we wouldn't be able to cast it. So what I'm just going to do is put an if statement around here. If me dot customer binding source dot position is greater than -1. So there's that position property that we can also use to get or set the current position of the customer binding source. So position and current go hand in hand, right? This is the index of where this object is in the binding source. Okay, so now when I do this, I can go ahead and maybe do a message box. We can do the same thing, row dot. Now you can see I have a type data set, so I've got our properties here. There's customer ID, last name, we'll just message box last name. Okay, so unlike the data view that isn't typed, right? So we have to cast our values. But the type data set makes it really nice because it shows up as properties right on our row. Okay, so now I'm just going to run this, hit F5. And let's get some data from the database through our table adapter. And now if I go to, say, Smith Jim, I set my position here and click this button, you'll then go ahead and see now I've got the row, current row. Okay, and if we go up to silver, there's silver. Okay, so it's that easy to get the current row that the user's sitting on by just using your current property of the binding source. Perform a couple casts using your snippet, and now you've got your type data row. So the last thing I want to show you with regard to working with data is how we can look at the changes that are being made that are going to be submitted through the table adapter to our database. So I'm going to go up to the Save Item Click event here, and what we can do is we can declare a new variable called ds_changes, and this is going to be a data set because on our customer data set, okay, there is a function or method called getChanges. Okay, and so what this does is that's going to dump all the changes into this new data set it's going to create for us. So if we have, say, 5 records and we only change one of them, only that one's going to be in there. And it will also have inserts, updates as well. Okay, so and deletes. It'll actually track deletes too. So go ahead and run this. Actually, I'm going to put a breakpoint here and basically stop the program and open the debugger right after we get the changes. So S, fill by last name. Okay, so I'm going to change Jim to Fred. And let's, for instance, add a new row. Last name, put my name in here. Okay, and press save. And now we're stopped here, but we can go ahead and hover over ds_changes, and you'll see this little magnifying glass. When we click on it, that'll open up what's called the dataset visualizer. Okay, and so we can see now these 2 rows have changed. You'll notice Amanda Silver is not in the set of changes because we didn't touch that row. So these 2 rows will be sent to our database, and that's how we can work with changes. So now this data set we can manipulate in any way we want before we actually submit the update. But let's go ahead and submit the update. And so now we've got all of these things saved. If we click on this again, you'll notice that there's nothing here. Okay, ds_changes is nothing. We've already submitted it. Okay, so that's how we can work with data in our code, and that's how data binding works. We have a database, we have the table adapter that communicates with the database, that updates and selects our data. We have a data set that makes sure that it keeps track of the changes and actually contains the structure and our data. And then we have the binding source that makes all of this glue code between the controls and the data set. And we can get the current positioning from the binding source. Okay, great. So I'd like to thank you for your time. If you'd like to check out the Visual Basic Developer Center, we'll be posting updates to these videos there. Please also check out the Visual Basic team blog and my blog for more information. Thanks again.